Hey y'all, Lossien here. Join me on a quest today as we turn all of this into this.
The first step to making Keyleth's arm sleeves is learning how to take the measurements. Once we have those, we can turn them into a pattern, and that pattern will turn into a mock-up or something that we try on to see what alterations we need to make. Then we'll make the alterations to the pattern. After that, we'll cut it out of the good fabric, which is what the final arm sleeves are made out of, and then we'll sew everything together one final time with all the finishing touches to have Keyleth's finished arm sleeves to go with the rest of your Keyleth Legends of Vox Machina costume.
Starting with our horizontal measurements, we're going to measure just under the bicep, because that's where the top of her glove is. We're also going to measure the elbow, and then we're going to bend the elbow, try and keep that on the bent part, and measure that as well. And then we're going to measure the wrist, and also across this part of the hand. So you want to leave your hand loose and you want to flex it, because those will be two different measurements. In terms of length, we're going to measure from the top to the elbow. We're going to continue that measurement down to the wrist, and then also just past the knuckles, because hers comes just above the knuckles, and that gives us a little extra space.
For my mock-up, I started at the top and then measured all the way down the length to the past the knuckles measurement. I went back and added in the elbow length and the wrist length so that I had all of my vertical measurements down. I drew one long vertical line all the way down so that I would have a center line to start from. Then I went through and extended all of those length measurements outward so that I had a horizontal line that would guide me on where to put my other measurements. Next, along each of those horizontal lines, I added our width measurements. Starting at the top, I put half of my below bicep measurement on each side of the center line. Then at the elbow, I put my unflexed elbow because I was using knit material that had some stretch. At the wrist, I did the same, and at the knuckles, I did the same, half on each side of that center line. Then I connected all those marks up the sides. I knew when I sewed up the sides together, I would want to leave a space open for my thumb, so I simply placed my hand on the pattern and put a mark at the bottom and the top of my thumb, which ended up being about a third of the way down and a quarter of the way up, so that I knew to put a notch there and not sew that part when I was putting it all together. I then added a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around, although on the very bottom where my knuckles were, I added an inch seam allowance so that I could finish it properly the way I wanted to. You can always add 3/4 of an inch if you prefer to have a bit more extra space when you're sewing things together because you're not as familiar, or because you just prefer to have a bit more extra space there. And then I cut the pattern out. For this one, I didn't actually go to the machine. I decided to just pin it because I didn't want to go to the machine. I pinned it from just below the elbow all the way to the top, and then I pinned it from the notch down of the thumb. I left the area from the bottom of the thumb to just below the elbow open because my mock-up fabric was non-stretch, even though my dark brown fabric was stretch, which meant that I would be able to get it on when I was finished and it was in the proper fabric, but I wouldn't be able to get it over my wrist now. I ended up pinning the wrist point once it was on me. If you're using a non-stretch fabric to do this entirely, you'll have to put a zipper in so you can get in and out of the actual sleeve. If you're using a knit material or something with stretch like a spandex, then you really should be making your mock-up out of a similar type of fabric. So you would sew all the way up. I was using a combination and forgot for some reason that things without stretch don't stretch. So you can just watch me struggle. I started by drawing a more accurate notch for my thumb, grouping the fabric together and seeing exactly where that fold was. Then, I drew just past my knuckles on the top and just on the inside of my knuckles on the bottom, so that it would go over my knuckles like it showed in the picture and be out of the way for me to use my hands on the inside and be more comfortable. Next, while referencing the pictures a lot, I drew all the other lines on it that showed where all the other fabric colors were. There are 2 bands of the dark brown at the top and at the bottom, so I drew the main one and then drew the second one to know where it was. I took the top edge down just a bit so it ended where I wanted it to, and I also liked how it fit along the side. This is a time when you would make a note if you need to make it wider, if you need to make it smaller, and adjust your pattern afterwards. All in all, I was very happy with it, even though it had really weird lines on it. Once I took it off, I laid it flat again, and then used my ruler to make sure that the 2 lines at the very top were even, and drew them better so they were straight across, because drawing on yourself is fairly difficult. Then, I made the bottom have the correct seam allowance on the sides because I needed to take it in a bit. And then I adjusted my seam allowance from the new edges of where the knuckles were on the inside and out, and evened up that seam so that it made sense along the outside edge. I just kind of curved it a bit more. Then I made the dark brown whoopy line look much nicer than I could actually draw it while it was on me. Swooped it properly. Then I measured the average width between the 2 lines that I had drawn and added that as a style line or a new seam line all the way along the bottom so it was an even amount. I really liked how much it was at the top, so that was the measurement that I used. The last step was to cut it all along those lines that we drew so that we could cut the actual pieces out. So I made a mental note that I had to add seam allowance to all of these pieces except at the very top. And I kind of kept them sorted by color, what was dark brown versus what was the medium brown. The only medium brown was the middle section. I also cut off all the extra seam allowance from where my hand was. I had very little of my medium brown left, so basically I just moved the pattern piece around until I found a place where it would actually fit and cut it. I made sure that the grain line was facing the right way, especially if this is a knit. You want to make sure that your stretch is going side to side, not up and down if it's only one-way stretch. If it's a 4-way stretch or 2-way stretch, then you're fine, because the stretch will go both up and down and side to side. I placed all of the dark brown pieces on the dark brown fabric, making sure there was space for all the seam allowance. And then it was actually time to make a slight adjustment to the top dark brown piece that was straight across. Because we want this to actually be folded in half so we can put an elastic in it. So what I did was place it down and trace it all the way around. And then on that edge that did not have seam allowance, I flipped it over along that edge and traced it out again. So that edge without seam allowance became our folded edge, and that meant there would be seam allowance past that on the other 2 sides. You can see me folding it in half here to make sure that I had it right. Then it was simply a matter of adding the seam allowance on my other 2 pieces, those squiggly pieces, along that squiggly line on both of them, and cutting them out.
So to put the sleeve together, we are going to start by putting this loopy piece onto this top piece, and then we will attach this lower part on. We are going to start by placing the top of the curve together on both sides. We're just going to give it a little pin in that 1/2 inch amount. Okay, so it kind of looks on top like this. I do this to make sure that these are 2 opposite sides because my fabric is the same on both sides. So this ensures that I get a left and a right. And we're going to start at the center there. And so I'm going to try to not stretch my knit. I do not recommend sewing a knit to a woven. Once it's sewn, I'm going to make sure all the seam allowance is pointing down towards the dark brown, and I'm going to top stitch it, which is a secondary stitch just beside the seam. Then repeat those 2 steps on the other side so that they're both at the same point. Next, I laid down my pattern pieces again and put the next pattern piece, which was the dark brown that was the bottom of the sleeve with the swoop in it. I lined it up as if I was looking at the whole thing together, good sides up, so the finished outside up. Then I took the piece that was underneath, the piece we had already sewn, and I flipped it up, matching up the top of the swoops, and pinned that the seam allowance amount. This meant that when I sewed along and matched everything together, it would make sure that it was the correct side and it would be good side to good side, so when we unfolded it in the end, it would look the right way. Once that was all sewn together, starting at the center working out one way and then starting at the center and working out the other way, taking my time to make sure not to stretch things, I opened it up and I pushed all the seam allowance from that new seam towards the bottom where the hand was and top stitched it again, about 1/8 away from that seam we had just sewn. Top stitching just makes sure that all the seam allowance goes the way you want it to. It looks nicer when you're putting garments on and off, and it makes sure that you don't have to fiddle with it once you're in it, because that can be annoying. And I repeated it for the second sleeve as well, double checking that it was facing the correct way, so I had a right and a left. So because this stretches and this does not, my pattern's going to be a little different. So I would say we'll sew down that seam from the very top all the way down to where the wrist is. So I've just sewn to the wrist indentation. Everything's going to have to be adjusted because of the knit. If I had done the mock-up in a knit, I could have made the adjustments then. Okay, so that's got to go there. Okay, so this has got to come in. Yeah, and then the other thing will go on top and it'll end about here. That's where I want it to. And then it comes in more here to get that a little straighter. In quite a bit here. And then this is going to come down actually a lot, which is fine. Because my knit is so stretchy, that's the knuckles, and that's the inside. So we're gonna trim this as best we can, giving myself about an inch just under. And the next thing we're going to do is fold this back twice to that line that we like as the actual finished line. And I'm going to stitch that across. I'm actually going to use a stretch stitch, which is 2 forward, 1 back. You can also use a zigzag. Because this seam is going to have to stretch across my hand, I really want to make sure that I have the space to do that. If I just do a normal type of stitch, it won't stretch properly and it'll break when I try to stretch it out.
Once the bottom was done, I folded it in half again, good sides facing inward so I was looking at all the seams, and sewed along down that side where I had marked the new seam. I kept using a stretchy stitch for when I was in the knit spot so it could stretch with my hand, and just switched to a normal stitch for the medium brown part.
And let's try that on again. This can come up just a little more so it connects with that line. I like the shape it's giving. It's a little tight on the elbow, but that's because I don't have a stretch there. Which means I can copy this over. And this is longer, this is shorter, that's what I want because they'll be on the opposite sides. So to figure out exactly how long I want this to be, I'm using that as a guide, then laying all the bits that I cut off on this side, so I know how much to cut off. And then I can draw with this how far in all these marks, all these stitching lines should be so that I have a guide. So now we're going to fold this over twice towards the back, stitch it down with that stretch stitch. Then we will connect these together, trim the extra, and we'll be starting in on the top part. Okay, so because I know my fabric stretches so much, I'm just gonna lay this out. Yeah, and we took it in so much, so I have to take this in even more, this top piece. Then, for these 2 top pieces, we're going to sew good side to good side, and we're going to connect the long side, so we're going to fold it in half lengthwise and sew all the way down. And do the same on the other one. Okay, we also want to make a small piece of elastic that will go at the top and cinch just a tiny amount, and you want like a ½ inch overlay. And we're going to make 2 of those. So I just measure it once, then cut and go. And then we're going to lay this over top. And I'm just going to sew back and forth where it's connected a couple times. Then we're going to turn these right side out. This is in theory where it's tricky. So what we want to do is open this up, open up this seam, and then fold it in half. Oh wait, before we do that, we're gonna put this on top and then fold this in half around the elastic so that your seam allowance is lined up. If you're not using a knit, the elastic might gather it a bit, and that's okay. Then we're going to put this on the outside here, lining up those seams, and I'm going to pin on the inside where that seam is, and I'm going to line up the opposite side and put a pin there as well. If you want more pins, you could do them at the quarter marks too. I'm not going to. Then we're going to sew all the way around the inside at that 1/2 inch seam allowance, making sure we're not catching the elastic, but we are catching both layers of the dark brown. Ta-da! We have one arm done. And then we're just going to repeat that top process on the other sleeve, and the sleeves will be done. I am happy with that. It's a little odd here because trying to put a knit on a non-knit is not easy. We might just go back and hand sew that. Sometimes you can just kind of pin the little issues and make it sit a little nicer. This one's pretty good. There's a little bit of fuzz at the top here that I can take out. And I'll have to keep pulling these down because they want to come up, which is fine. That gives me lots of actual able to use my hand space. Hey, hey. So, all in all, the arm things are okay. They could be better if this color was also stretch. It would solve a lot of the fit issues I have where I can't bend my arm past here. Like I can't touch my own shoulder because it's too tight. But apart from that, overall, I like it. Right now I've got hot shots in here from shooting, so it's the weird shape you see. But yeah, overall, I'm really happy with them. Let me know how yours went. Did you use knits? Did you use wovens? I highly recommend the knits. I cannot say that enough, like a spandex so you can actually shift because this part's very comfortable. So, thanks for coming along on this journey, and I'm excited to see what yours looked like. Tag me on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. Those are the main ones. And I'll see you next time. Cat.